It was early December. I was at home this night, spending my day off inside by the fireplace. It was way too cold and snowy out for my liking. I did a bunch of things around the house that needed to get done, but otherwise it was a relaxing day. I had the news running in the background, listening to how high winds and possible blizzards were to be expected starting tonight by 5. I was already starting to notice it getting worse outside. I sat on the couch and turned on a different channel around 7. Though I could hear wind slamming against the house, and it really did sound like there was a blizzard. I got up and went to the window facing the backyard to see how it looked outside at first. All I saw was snow rushing to the ground with almost no visibility. But then I saw something else. A figure walking through my backyard. My backyard was pretty big and didn't have a fence, so it wouldn't have been that unexpected if it weren't for the blizzard going on outside. Whoever was out there was just walking at a regular pace, going toward the end of my yard, before the snow and darkness took over any sight I had of them. I stayed by the window for a minute, trying to catch one more look and figure out what they were doing, but I didn't see anything. I was honestly scared for them, but also couldn't see why they'd be out there at all. The end of my yard that they were walking to led to a road, but it wouldn't get them anywhere for miles, which was not doable on foot. I went back to the TV, but I still couldn't help thinking about it, and only 5 minutes later there was a knock at the door. I went over and cracked it open. It was a man in a heavy winter jacket. His nose was bright red and his face was pale white, like he'd been out in the cold for a while. I couldn't know if this was the same person I'd seen in my backyard, but my immediate guess was that it was. "How can I help you?" I asked the man. Let out a humble smile and spoke through shaking teeth that he was waiting for a ride to pick him up, and asked if he could stay in my house for a few minutes to shelter from the cold just until the ride got here. I took a moment to respond because I actually considered it. Given the state of the weather, it's easy to say that under no circumstance would you let a random man inside your house, but when they're practically freezing to death on your doorstep and asking for your help, the answer on what to do isn't as black and white. I told him he could wait on my porch, which had an overhang that blocked the snow, and offered to give him an old jacket of mine if he needed it. The man didn't look too happy, but just nodded and went off to the side and sat on the chair. I had out there. I closed and locked the door, then went upstairs to grab my old jacket. It was way too big for me and was in horrible condition, but obviously that shouldn't matter. In this kind of scenario, I picked it up and walked downstairs, about to unlock the door and open it. But something stopped me just a moment before. I don't know what it was, but it made me hesitate. I leaned over and looked through the peephole. The man was now standing right up against the door with his hand on the handle, like he was preparing to push it open. As soon as I unlocked it, I felt my heart rate increasing as I took a couple steps back and quietly pulled my phone out to dial 911 as I whispered into the phone. I just stared at the door with wide eyes, knowing what was waiting for me on the other side. Once the police said they were on their way, I slowly crept over and looked out again. The man wasn't there, not on my porch or anywhere in my front yard. He was just gone, like he knew that I had called the police. Nothing else was found that night, and no signs of him ever showed up again. What he would have done if I had opened the door, I can't be sure of, but hopefully he never comes back. This happened last January. I had taken a week off of work following New Year's, mostly in hopes that everyone else would be back at work by then, and I could enjoy the week without it being busy everywhere. My plans consisted of shopping around and really just chilling at my apartment by myself. On this day, I was out driving around in the snow and going to a few stores, then made my way back to the apartment by 7 p.m. I went inside and cooled off, then took a seat on the couch with some snacks I had just got. I was watching TV and even dozing off a little bit from the long day out of the house. But then, at some time around 8:30, the PA system in my apartment buzzed, meaning that someone was outside and wanting me to let them in the building. I had no plans of anyone coming over, so I had no idea who it was. They buzzed my room again, so I got up and went to the window that faced the front of the building. I tried to not lift the blinds too much, only enough for me to see who it was at the door. To the apartment building was a large man. It was still snowy out and kind of dark, but I could tell he was older, like mid-40s, but I had never seen him before. There were only 3 other people living in the complex at the time, so I was at least familiar with who lived here, and he was not one of them. I also figured that if he did live here, or was visiting one of the other people, then they would let him in. I walked over to the PA system and muted it, then got back to the couch and continued watching TV. I really didn't put any more thought into it and even dozed off several times in the next hour. Eventually, I shut off the TV and went to bed. By then, it had to be around 10. I fell asleep just about as soon as I laid down a few hours into the night. My eyes shot open to a thud from just outside my room. It was extremely loud, but having just woken up to it, I didn't know what it was or exactly where it came from. My heart was racing as I stared across the room at my door, listening for anything else. It was very quiet now, almost like nothing even happened. I got out of bed and slowly moved toward the door, then leaned my ear against it to listen to the other side. It was still quiet. Nothing more than the walls creaking from the building. I turned the handle and looked out into the living room, not seeing anything out of the ordinary. The whole place was really dark though, and for some reason I still felt like I needed to be quiet and not make myself known. So I left the lights off as I moved through the living room and looked down the front hallway. The door to my apartment was fully open. I froze up staring at the open doorway and feeling fear run through my whole body. It almost didn't seem real. I took a few steps back, staying quiet, and made my way back toward my room. And now on the other side of the door, I could see a huge dent in the wood right by the knob. Once I saw that, I ran in and locked it behind me, then called 911 while hiding in the closet. I was sure that whoever it was had to be somewhere inside my apartment still, and it would only be a matter of time before they get into my room. But as I waited for the police, the apartment stayed silent. Whoever had broken into my apartment was gone. Even the police couldn't find anything to help in finding them. What they think happened is the intruder tried buzzing all the other rooms as well, until one of them was nice enough to let them in once he was in the main stairwell. It's not really clear why he chose to go for my room. Maybe they thought it was empty. What's really strange is the dent on my bedroom door, which was likely the source of the thud that I'd woken up to. But it was just one single hit, not looking like a real attempt at breaking the door down, but more like something out of frustration. Before he left, I still live in the same apartment and nothing else has happened. Who it was and what they wanted is unknown. I was visiting my family for the holidays last year. They live 15 hours away, and I usually try to tough it out in one long drive. But this year snow had come early and made driving a lot slower, so I was prepared to stop at a hotel somewhere along the way. I didn't book anything in advance since I didn't know how far I'd get before wanting to stop. I was just going to pull into Where Forever and see if they had a room available when I left. It was barely snowing, but the further out I got, the more snow seemed to be coming down. Roads were still clear, but everyone was definitely driving more slow and carefully around 8 hours into the drive. I still hadn't made it halfway there. I was getting frustrated as it was already 9 p.m. and it was just taking so long. I should have been over halfway there at this point, but now I felt like I had to keep going so that my drive tomorrow wouldn't be even longer. The snow had let up a little bit, but it still had accumulated on the road because there were no plow trucks. I drove as long as I could, making it to 12 a.m. before deciding I'd had enough and needed some sleep. I pulled off the next exit and into a small motel parking lot. It was a long one-story building with 10 or so rooms as expected. It wasn't the nicest looking place. The outside looked really old, and even the lights on the sign were dim and half burnt out. I parked in a random place near the rooms and got out, walking up to the main entrance area inside. It was a very small room with a front desk, but there was a sign propped up on the counter. It said, "Be back in 15" with a little picture of a coffee cup on it. The chances of me arriving while the worker was taking their break just showed my lack of luck on this drive. I walked out and back to my car. But this time when I looked around the parking lot, I noticed something that I hadn't before it was completely empty. I stood there in the cold and looked for a minute and didn't see a single car, and from the looks of it, it didn't look like any cars had even been in the parking lot tonight. I got back in my car and turned on the heat to warm up while I waited. Seeing no cars and nobody at the desk had me second-guessing whether the sign was actually for someone taking a break. There were no places within 15 minutes anyway, so I don't know where they could have driven off to if they were taking a break. I sat back and tried to think of what to do next, but my eyes and head were so tired, and I ended up passing out in my seat. When I woke up, a few hours must have passed. The snow had started pouring down again and the wind was making my car sway. I sat up and looked toward the front entrance of the motel, but immediately made eye contact with a man peering in through my window. I jolted back as he stepped away and yelled something toward the parking lot. I looked behind him, seeing a truck on the other side. Another man got out of the driver's side and started walking up the one by me, then walked around my car trying all the door handles. I snapped out of it and put my car in reverse, trying to back out before the wheels spun under me. Now the men were moving quicker, one yelling at the other to come over to his side and break the back window. I continued moving my car back and forth, trying to get through the thick patch of snow, but the sudden shattering of the back window only made it harder. I was trying everything now, as one of the men was reaching in for the door handle, and just when he put half of his body through the window and opened the door, I finally got traction and spun the car around. The man fell out, and the other tried to get in his truck to follow me as I turned the car and made my way out of the parking lot once I was back on the road, though they stopped following me. Although I don't feel like it was entirely my fault, I definitely should have not let myself fall asleep in that parking lot, especially in the middle of nowhere like that. What those men had planned could have been anything. They were obviously prepared, though, and it almost seemed like they knew that this motel parking lot was an easy place to target people. But whatever it was, I'll probably never know. I worked at a retail store in my 20s as an overnight lead. It wasn't one of your regular big chain grocery stores. It was a local place with only about 8 or 9 locations. Most nights I'd have an overnight stalker to help out. But it wasn't uncommon for me to spend the whole shift alone again. Not the biggest store. So it really wasn't a very intense working environment. A lot of the time I'd find myself working slow, just so I wouldn't run out of things to do. This was one of those nights where I was alone and working at a steady pace at the beginning of my shift. I loaded up some boxes and moved into the aisles to start stalking. It doesn't take much mental effort, so my mind was elsewhere and just thinking about random things, not really paying any attention. I went through about 3 aisles until a knock at the front entrance made me jump. I almost didn't even realize what it was because I was so spaced out. But once I did, I got really confused. I heard them knock again loud enough to echo through the store. I walked down to the end of the aisle and looked through the large front windows, seeing a man in a hood standing at the doors. I went up to the other side. "We're closed. Won't be open until 8 a.m. I said through the glass. The man looked at me but didn't say anything. I pointed at the sign on the door. "We're closed." "Sorry." I repeated. The man continued to look at me for a few seconds, then turned and walked away. I watched him walk until I couldn't see him anymore. But it didn't look like he had parked anywhere. The whole thing was odd to say the least, but I figured he was just at the wrong place or something. I went back to what I was doing, stocking up the shelves and eventually forgetting about the man by 2 a.m. I got in through half of the aisles and was ready to take my lunch break. I left the boxes where they were and went to the break room on the other end of the building. I was in there for probably a good half hour before I tossed the rest of my lunch and went back to work. I walked through the store and to the end of the aisle I was working on. But just as I looked up, there was a man walking past the other end. He looked like he was just walking across the store, not having noticed me. I froze in place, feeling that instant rush of fear, now listening intently. I could hear the man's footsteps move toward the side of the building I'd just come from, so I moved into the aisle and hid behind the shelves. The footsteps sounded like they went toward the break room, but just before I left the aisle to try and run and get help, I heard the man rushing out of the room. The footsteps were now sprinting through the store, getting closer and closer. I ran for the other end of the aisle, looking back and seeing the man turn in and start running at me. I ran for the front door, getting my keys out and trying to unlock it with shaky hands. The man appeared at the end of the aisle just as I got it open, and just as I stepped out of the building, I saw a bright flash in the corner of my eye and heard a pop sound that made my ears ring, a gunshot so loud I didn't even know where it landed. but I sprinted for my life around the building. I made it to my car and hid in the back seat as I called 911. From what I know, the man didn't follow me outside. He was gone by the time police made it to the store. But they found the back door to be busted open, along with some heavy tools sitting next to it. The most terrifying of their findings was the hole created by the gunshot sitting right to the side of the front doors. Why the man broke in and was so aggressive targeting me like that is unknown from his behavior. The police seemed to think it was some kind of mental breakdown or psychotic break, not having any real reason to target me specifically, other than the fact that I was alone. I no longer work there, but I can tell you that for the years following that incident, I was on edge every single night. It was a snowy night. When I pulled into the parking lot of my gas station, I worked the overnight 11 to 7 shift and had been at the job for several months before this. I really didn't like this job, but finding somewhere else to work was really difficult, and due to how some things were. In other aspects of my life, night shifts were the best for my personal schedule still, though I went in tired every night and struggled to get through every shift. I parked in front of the building beside the only other car in the parking lot, which was my coworker's. Then I went inside and relieved him of his shift. He left a couple minutes later, and then it was just me. For the rest of the night, my manager had a paper on the desk with some things to get done, but from reading it over, it wasn't all that much. My guess was that it would take no more than an hour total to complete all the tasks, so I tried to put it off as long as possible to save me from falling asleep once I started getting really tired. But as I sat there behind the desk and somewhere around 12 a.m., a car pulled into the station. I glanced out the window, seeing an old SUV parked by one of the pumps, of course, with it snowing outside. Most people were not driving around, but getting a customer every once in a while was normal. I went back to my phone and scrolled through some videos, not paying much attention for probably 10 minutes until I looked back outside and saw the SUV was still there by the pump. The headlights were off, and the doors were closed, looking like they should be pumping gas. But it had been so long, I stood up and got closer to the window, looking down both sides of the building. But nobody was anywhere outside. If they had been in their car for the past 10 minutes with it off, they'd have to be freezing. It was snowy, windy, and cold, so I honestly got a little nervous for them. I paid more attention for the next few minutes, waiting to see any movement through the dark windows or for someone to get back inside their car. But there was nothing. It was like the car was just abandoned, right next to the pump. After some thought, I put on my jacket and went outside immediately. I knew I was right. It was way too cold for anyone to be in there with the car off, or for anyone to even be outside. For more than a few minutes, I rushed over to the car and looked around, then put my face close to the window and tried to look inside. "Hello, anyone in there? Just checking to see if you're okay," I called out. But from what I could see, there wasn't anyone inside. It wasn't exactly easy to see, so someone could have been, but I was pretty sure there wasn't. Now even more confused, I backed up and looked around at the empty gas station parking lot. Before starting to walk back, now with my eyes not focused on the car, I was just looking at the ground and noticed shoe prints in the snow going toward the building. Not really the front of the building, but kind of off to the side. I looked back and saw that they seemed to come from the car. But at this point I was freezing and didn't want to investigate further without warming up a bit. First read inside and turned on the small heater next to the counter, putting my hands in front of it to warm them up. I was only inside for 30 seconds to a minute though, before a thump resonated through the building from behind me. I spun around, not seeing anything, then walked around the counter and toward the back on the floor. There were puddles of dirty water like snow that had melted off someone's boots, feeling a chill run through me. I stepped closer to the back room and turned the corner toward where the supply room was. Standing in the dark behind one of the shelves, I could see the outline of a figure. They were tall with broad shoulders and had a large, scruffy beard, and they were looking right at me. My heart stopped for a moment, but after the initial shock, my reaction was to just walk back to the counter. I don't know why. Maybe I was just too shocked to react appropriately after staring at the doorway to the supply room for, I don't even know how long. I quietly picked up the store phone and called the police, whispering for help. Then I endured the most unnerving 10 minutes of my life. As I waited during this time, I didn't hear or see anything from the supply room. which honestly added to my fear. For some reason, the man never came out to confront me. When 2 cops finally pulled in and came inside, I quietly told them where the man was. They searched the room while I stayed by the front, but I was shocked when they came out with nobody else. The man was gone. Watery shoe prints surrounded the back door, but outside were fresh tracks in the snow, going straight away from the gas station straight into the completely dark, empty field that led on for miles. Obviously, nobody could search that at night, but even when they did in the follow-up days, they didn't find anything. I mean, the field was huge. He could have gone anywhere, but it was so cold and windy that night that I was almost sure that they'd find a body the SUV was taken in for, hopefully more information. I don't know how or why, but for some reason they couldn't find any history of ownership, so that left us with just what we know from that night, and we are still left with just that. Who the man was and what he was doing remains unsolved, and where he is now is just as much of a question. I do deliveries for my local Papa John's. I'm in college, so this is just one of the few jobs I could choose from. A few of my friends work here too, but we're all delivery drivers. So even when we have the same shifts, we don't really see each other anyway. This happened to me last December while I was picking up some extra shifts. Before Christmas this night, it was snowing a good amount, making deliveries take longer than usual, while also getting more deliveries than usual. I was never too stressed about work though. Having to go nonstop for hours on end was definitely not as enjoyable at 9:30. I grabbed my next set of orders to deliver and got in my car to get the directions up. I had 2 orders and the houses were just 5 minutes from each other, but they were both pretty far from the shop. They were 15 minutes away, which was more like 25 minutes in this weather. The first part of the drive was normal, but then it began taking me toward the less visited part of town. The houses here were older, and most of the shops in the area had closed. Nobody ever came around here unless they lived here because it was so old and just wasn't up to today's standards after 20 minutes of driving. I pulled into one of the neighborhoods and drove down the road toward the first house. The road was very bare, no cars parked on the side, and most of the houses kind of looked empty. Once I got to the first address, I parked on the road and walked up to the front door. A kind old man answered the door and paid for the pizza. Then I went back and set the directions for the next house. It was in the same neighborhood. But I realized as I drove that it was taking me deeper into the neighborhood, to the point where there were less houses and more space between them. By the time I got to the address, I couldn't see any other houses around. It was just trees surrounding the area again. I parked on the street and walked up to the front door. I knocked and waited patiently on the porch. It was pretty cold out though, and the snow making my clothes soaked wasn't helping. Finally, after a minute, the door opened. It was a middle-aged woman who looked like she'd just woken up. Her hair was messy, and she had tired, emotionless eyes. "I have your order here for 2 pizzas," I said, holding out the boxes and giving her the total to pay. She took the boxes and placed them on the table next to her, then told me to wait a moment for her to get cash. Another minute went by before they opened the door again. She started sifting through some cash, counting it slowly and trying to add it all up. There was definitely something weird about her. It's hard to pinpoint what it was exactly, but everything she was doing was just very odd. Then, as if she wasn't struggling enough on counting the cash, she started up small talk with me. Normal stuff like how my day was and all that. I responded politely, but it was just really weird, like she was stalling at some point while she was talking. I looked back at my car just to distance myself from the uncomfortable situation for a moment, but I was quick to see a man standing right next to it. He was looking in the windows and doing something to the door, but when I looked back at the woman, her face had shifted into anger. I figured it all out too late though, as she reached out and grabbed me, then started yelling to the man by my car. He turned around and started sprinting towards us. As the woman tried to pull me into the house, I pushed her away and broke free. Then my instincts took hold of me and I sprinted into the trees. I could hear the man's heavy footsteps crunching in the snow behind me all the way through the forest until finally they started to fade away. After 2 minutes of sprinting, I stopped to catch my breath. Luckily, the moon was lighting up the forest enough for me to navigate through it and back to one of the streets in the neighborhood. I called 911. Once I got service, and after 10 minutes of waiting in the cold, an officer arrived. Another patrol car went to the house, finding the man outside in the act of trying to break into my car to keep things from dragging on. Basically, the motive was likely due to the couple running out of money and resorting to robbing my vehicle. The whole distraction was so that the man could rob my car without me ever knowing. But since I saw what he was doing, it's not really clear what they would have done. Maybe they would have just let me go, but it's obvious I would have reported them. So I don't think it's likely they would have. I'm just thankful for getting away unharmed and for being the first victim they tried it on before getting arrested, and never having the chance to do anything to anyone else. For the past decade, I've lived a quiet life in Utah. I own a small cabin in a town of people living the same life as me. There's a town center for shops and everything, but most people have cabins or houses a few miles out with either farms or just plain land. I didn't farm or anything, but I do have a lot of grassy land that borders some mountains. This happened almost 10 months ago now. It was around 8 p.m. one night, and I was sitting outside by the fire pit on my laptop. I did this almost every night except when it was snowing out. It was always a calming way to end the evening before going to bed. But this night was different. I was out there for an hour, really zoned in on my laptop, when through the crackling campfire I heard something in front of me. I lifted my head, seeing a man standing on the other side of the flame, maybe 15 feet across from me. The man looked like a typical guy in his 40s that lived around here, big and rugged with a large gray beard. I stood up from my chair. "What are you doing here? Where did you even come from?" I said. Trying to hide the shakiness of my voice, the man stared at me with a look I'd only assume was that of someone about to do something terrible. But then he looked past me at my house. I kept my gaze on him as he began walking toward the front of the cabin. He went up to one of the windows and quickly peered inside, saying something under his breath as he turned and started to walk away. I called out again, asking what he was doing, and threw in some unfriendly words, but the guy just ignored me. He walked down all the way to where the grass met the trees, and then he was gone. It was completely insane. Some guy being out here right by my house was no accident, especially not at this time of night, and the way he was acting was beyond strange. It was like he was looking for something and had no fear of intruding on me. I put out the fire right away and went inside, locking up the cabin and getting my sidearm out, just in case I didn't think he was going to come. 56, 55, back. But I wasn't sure about anything anymore as far as the police go. Calling them out here would take way too long to be a viable option if something were to happen. I was on my own, as that's just the way things are here. I stayed up for several more hours, way past the time I usually went to bed, and kept my eyes and ears open for anything. I don't remember the time, but it had to be at least 1 a.m., maybe even 2 a.m. When I finally passed out on the couch, I was trying my hardest to stay awake, but it just didn't happen when I woke up. Though, there was an unusual constant sound. Wind blowing through the house. I sat up, still confused and tired, and looked over at the front door. It was wide open. I jumped up and ran to the door, looking outside in all directions, but not seeing anything in the dark. I slammed it shut and locked it, then turned around to face the possibility of someone being inside my house. I stood there by the door for an entire minute, listening for any sounds of someone being inside. It was a small cabin, so even something like heavy breathing might be loud enough to hear, but it was dead silent. Only the creaking of the wood from the wind outside. I slowly stepped through the hallway and into each room, checking every corner and opening every door, but nobody was inside after that. I stayed up all night, and as soon as the sun came up, I drove into town and filed a report with the police, making the assumption that the man I'd seen that night was likely the one who'd broke into my cabin. The one issue with all of it is the motive. There were a few odd things missing, which meant he definitely had broken in and walked around the house while I was passed out, but nothing they took was worth any real value, and of course they didn't harm me either. So what they intended is still undetermined, and without knowing why they came to my cabin, there's no saying whether or not they'll come back. This was just last winter in early February. I was driving to my next-door dash order. I was a bit tired as I'd been driving for the last 4 hours, and it was almost 12 a.m. After this one, I was definitely calling it a night and heading home, as I was worried about getting sleepy on the road, especially with all the ice and snow. I was driving down a fairly empty road, though it was a side road that connected two of the main towns in our city. But there was a 5-meter stretch that had nothing, no buildings or houses or anywhere to stop. As I was driving down this section, I don't really know what happened, but I just got hit with a wave of tiredness that made me lose focus on the road for just a few seconds. But that was all it took, I guess. I hit a patch of ice and slid toward the side, and although I fully woke back up at this point, it was too far gone. I tried to steer back onto the road, but my car just slid straight off and into the small ditch between the road and the woods. It wasn't a bad crash at all, since the snow lightened the impact, but it still made me a little shaky, and I knew right away that it was going to be impossible to get out of this. My car was stuck on the incline of the ditch and in thick snow. I didn't even bother getting out to try and see how bad it was, though. I did test my luck at trying to maneuver the car to get some traction, but if anything, I just made it worse in the middle of trying to figure everything out. I noticed the car's headlights down the road. At first, I thought it was just a car passing by, but after a few seconds, it was clear that they weren't moving. Someone must have just been parked down the road with their headlights on, which I found to be a little unnerving. At the coincidence of it being on this long, empty road. They weren't close enough to have stopped to try and help me, but they weren't far enough either to not see my headlights. I pulled out my phone and called my dad, knowing he'd still be awake and hoping he'd be able to help me. I'd never been in a situation like this, so I really didn't know what to do. He said he would call roadside assistance and then drive down to wait with me. I thanked him and felt relief knowing he would be down here in just a few minutes. I looked back out on the road looking for the headlights from the car I'd just seen, but now they were gone. It was too dark to see anything that far without light, so I didn't know if they'd driven away or were still there, and it just turned off their lights. It started to creep me out. The more I thought about it, I kept my eyes down the road, not looking away for more than a few seconds, as I began getting paranoid. It was something about the silence as well that made it more uneasy. Only hearing the wind outside my car and nothing else then. After 3 minutes of waiting, I saw a figure walking toward my car. He was down the road coming from the direction where the headlights had been. I watched him as he slowly made his way through the snow, getting to just about 15 feet from the front of my car. Then he stopped. He stood there, in the snow, facing me, but not moving. I couldn't see much of him as he had a hoodie covering his face, but the way he just stood there in my headlights started to terrify me. After a moment, I honked my horn softly a few times just to let them know that I was in the car and that I could see them. They still didn't move or acknowledge me, but just as I was pulling out my phone to call my dad again, the man turned around and walked away, disappearing down the road. I still called my dad to let him know about this really strange person that was out here, and he said he was just a minute away. I stayed on the phone with him this time, and only 30 seconds later I saw headlights turn on down the road and begin moving toward my car. Once they were right across the road, they parked and turned off their lights. I couldn't see over the ditch, but I heard a door open as I yelled through the phone what was going on. But then my dad's car pulled right in front of my view and screeched to a stop. I heard him yell at someone as they got back in their car and sped away. They didn't come back. But my dad said the guy was holding something in his hands that looked like he was going to break into my car. With everything went okay after that, though. And the car ended up not even having much damage to it. I'm not sure what was about to happen that night, but I know I'm really lucky to have not found out. I work as a mechanic for a car shop in my town. It's a locally owned and run repair place that started up many years ago. The shop runs out of an old warehouse and has a bunch of broken down cars and pieces of cars sitting outside in what we refer to as the scrapyard. It's just the name we give it. Most of the scrapyard is just cars waiting for parts anyway. My job for the past 2 years has been to order and keep track of stock that goes in and out, and the best time to do this is when it isn't busy. So overnight, I guess I kind of doubled as a security guard too, because it wasn't uncommon for crazy people and teenagers to jump the fence and try to mess with or steal stuff from the scrapyard on this night. I got into work at 800 talking to my boss for a bit before he left, and then it was just me in the warehouse. It was raining outside, so Inside the building it was really noisy, but also calming in a way. I did my usual routine of going through the orders that the mechanics had sent in and checking what had been used during the day. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but 2 cars needed to order very specific parts, and for one of them the mechanic didn't write down the model year, which sometimes can be really important. I got up from the desk and walked through the warehouse looking for this gray Nissan Versa so I could confirm what part to get. But as I got to the end of the warehouse, I still didn't see it. I sighed, knowing it had to be in the scrapyard, which of course was on the one day that it was raining out. I went back to my desk, and after a brief coffee break, I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and went to the back door. The rain seemed to have picked up since I was last outside, but in the distance I could see the car I was looking for hiding between a few other vehicles. I stepped out into the rain and started walking over, turning on my flashlight as I got about to the center of the scrapyard, though a sudden movement from something in front of me made me stop in my tracks. It was at the edge of the light, and I wasn't exactly paying attention, but it looked like a person moving from behind. Behind one of the cars, the rain covered up any sound I would have heard, though. So I just stood there and held my flashlight up, waiting for any more movement. "Hello, I saw you already, just get out of here," I yelled, hoping it was just some kid messing around. I took a few steps closer to where I'd seen them and yelled again for them to leave the property. I didn't see anything. So I moved closer and started to look around the whole area, but whoever was there must have left already. Honestly, I was relieved that I didn't have to call the cops or do anything drastic. I quickly walked over to the Nissan and got the model year, then jogged back to the warehouse and went inside. I took off my jacket and sat back at the desk, filling out the rest of the info and sending through the order. I was there for another half hour filling out more of the order requests, then I had to do the stock counting in the actual warehouse part of the building. By then it was probably 12:30 or 1 a.m. I walked along the shelves and checked what everyday products and parts had been used up. While making my way down the first set of shelves, a sudden thud rang through the warehouse, and then the lights went out. I stood with my eyes wide open, staring into the abyss of dark. I couldn't see anything but between the sound of the rain hitting the roof. I could hear footsteps walking through the building. I stared in the direction of where the sound was coming from and could immediately tell that they were coming toward me. I didn't know what to do at this point. I was sure that whoever was in here had shut off the power, but why they were here I didn't know, and without any light, I couldn't even run away. All I could do was listen to their footsteps grow louder as I stared into the pitch black. Hoping they didn't know where I was, they were only about 10 feet away when I heard them stop. After a moment, I heard a box open and things being shifted around before the footsteps began going away. I was holding my breath the whole time, and after 30 seconds it was completely silent. I waited for a few minutes before finally taking my phone out and calling 911, then using the flashlight on it to move toward the breaker room and flipping the power switch back on, looking through the warehouse with the police. All that was left were the wet shoe prints going through the building and out the back door. It seemed like the person that was out in the scrapyard had probably slipped in while I was outside and the door was still unlocked. Then they obviously stole a bunch of gear from our warehouse, even though they likely didn't have the intent to hurt me. Who knows what could have happened if they knew I was standing only a few feet from them, and without me ever getting a look at them, there's a chance that they came fully armed and willing to do anything. This happened last year. It was the beginning of spring, and we were going through a rainy month where pretty much every day there was some kind of downpour, either light drizzling or on storms. I do deliveries for a popular restaurant in my area, so rain isn't the most amazing thing when I have to be running through it all the time to pick up and drop off orders. This night started as any other. I got to work at 600 and drove around a couple orders before getting one to deliver somewhat far away. It was 10 miles out from our restaurant, going into the more woodsy part of town. It wasn't all forest or anything. It was just more spread out and less densely populated. The roads were all covered by trees, and most neighborhoods weren't visible from the main roads while driving, though there was only one car behind me. Not in a weird way, but that's just how empty the road was. But once I got maybe 2 miles, in a beam of someone's headlights in front of me came out of nowhere, revealing a car in the middle of the road. Swerving to a stop, I slammed on my brakes as the car was now sideways, blocking the whole road. The guy behind me did the same, stopping so close to me that I was surprised we didn't collide after the initial seconds of shock. I looked up at the car in the middle of the road. It was a beat-up-looking sedan, and they had their brights on, still making it too blinding to see who was in the car. I'd say that whoever was in there had to have been falling asleep at the wheel, or just not paying attention, but they seemed to have intentionally left their headlights off until the last second when they swerved into the road. I didn't see where they came from, it was too dark. So I'm not sure if they were just driving down the road, or if they came from the side of the road. The car behind me laid on their horn, clearly frustrated by whatever this was. I probably should have been more skeptical. But in the moment when something crazy like this happens, it's hard to think straight. Either way though, the car behind me was too close for me to move back, and the car in front was blocking the whole way forward. So I couldn't go anywhere unless one of them moved first after a while, of the guy behind me honking. He stopped and got out of his car. I looked in the mirror, seeing a large man begin walking through the rain. He looked furious as he passed right by my car and walked up to the other. He stood at their window angrily yelling at whoever was in there, but with the rain, I could barely hear what he was saying, and I couldn't hear anything at all of what the other person was saying, if they even were responding. I saw the man outside bang on the window a few times as he yelled, but then he suddenly stopped and went quiet. He slowly backed away from the window, then nervously walked back to his car. As he was getting in the driver's side of the other car, a man stepped out wearing a thick hoodie that covered most of his face. I was now getting really freaked out and still had no way of leaving other than running out of my car and into the woods, which was probably a terrible idea. So I sat there and watched as the man quickly made his way up to the car behind me. But just as he got to the door, the car floored backwards, their tires reached as they slid against the pavement, losing control and sliding off the road. They made it past a few trees before eventually slamming into one further into the woods. The man that was still on the road turned and looked at my car, making eye contact with me in my side mirror. Horrified, I put my car in reverse and pressed on the gas, backing out past him, then turned around and sped off. I obviously called the police, but still had no idea what was really going on there that night. An officer got to the scene about 15 minutes after I'd left, and the only thing there was the car wedged in the woods against a tree. The other car was gone, and neither of the men were there. I think we can all assume what probably happened without even having any reasoning to go off of, but there's still a million questions that need answers. All I can say is that if the other guy behind me wasn't there, I likely would be in his place right now. This only happened a few months ago. I recently moved into a very small one-story house that was close to my place of work. I used to have to drive almost an hour every day. So this move was really nice. The only thing was that I'd never really been anywhere in the area outside of where I worked, so it really was like moving to a completely different place anyway. This night I got off at 6 and drove straight home. I had to work again the next day, so I wasn't planning on doing much, probably just chill and eat for a bit, then get in bed. I pulled into my garage and went inside, warming up some leftover pizza in the oven. But while it was heating up, there was a ring at my doorbell. It actually made me jump, because I hadn't heard the doorbell before, but I had no idea who would be here either. I walked down to the front door and looked. It was a woman. She looked maybe 50 and had long gray hair. I opened the door. "Hi, how can I help you?" She smiled wide and said she'd noticed I'd moved in recently. We talked for a minute as she asked about where I came from, if I had a wife or kids, and all that random small talk. Then she said goodnight and walked off. I never really had the chance to ask her who she even was, but I assumed she was just some old lady that lived down the block, but something about her, though, just felt off. I don't know how else to describe it, but I wasn't sure if there was actually something off, or if it was just because she was old. I went back to the kitchen and got my pizza, then sat on the couch and started looking for a good video on YouTube to watch. I found some random commentary video to run as background noise while I ate, but only 10-ish minutes passed before I noticed a noise from outside. I paused the TV and listened, realizing it was an idle car engine, but it was really loud. I got up and looked out the front window. There was a car parked right in front of my house. It was running, but all the headlights were off. I looked down both sides of the road, seeing the whole street was empty, with tons of other places to park. Yet they had chosen right in front of my house. I watched the car for a couple minutes, but with no changes. I went back to the couch. A whole half hour went by with the car's engine still being audible right outside the house until it suddenly shut off. I paused the TV again and listened, not hearing anything else. After a minute, I got up and walked over to the window, looking out and seeing the car exactly how it was before, except it obviously wasn't running anymore. Again, nobody else was outside. It was just this one car. I shut the blinds just to make sure nobody was watching me for some reason. Then I went back to the couch and started cleaning up. But there was only a moment before a quiet thump sounded from the other side of the house, already feeling a little on edge. I walked over to the hallway and looked down toward the kitchen for a split second. I saw the shadow of someone walking away from the back door as if they'd noticed me and were trying to hide their footsteps. Quickly ran around the house toward the front. And when I looked out the window, I saw a man getting inside the parked car, driving away. Immediately, the first thing I did was go to the back door and open it, trying to figure out why he was out there. And it only took me a few seconds to notice that the handle on the outside was really loose, like they had been trying to take it off, even just by pulling the flimsy handle a bit to the side. I could see the inner workings of the lock in the door, meaning he probably would have been able to unlock it, and he was only moments away from getting inside my house. I can't say for certain if the old lady from before had anything to do with it. I know it sounds strange that she would, but I thought about the questions she was asking me, which all had to do with whether anyone else lived with me. Maybe she was getting information to know if I was a good target for whatever they planned. It's been a few months since, and I've never seen her or the man again. I was working late one night in my office trying to finish writing a report I was due in a few days. I had some tea to help keep me energized and was trying to get it all done as fast as possible. Staying up late was a regular thing I had to do for work, and it's always been difficult for me to maintain focus once I start getting tired anyway. As I worked in my office, and somewhere around 11, there was a knock at the front door. I got up and looked down the hallway. I didn't know why anyone would be at my door at this time. I walked down to the other end of the house and looked out the peephole, but nobody was outside on my porch. I took a step back and thought that it may have not actually been the front door. I was so focused on work and was on the opposite side of the house, so when I heard the light knocking sound, I just assumed it was someone at the door. I didn't know what else it could have been, but I just went back to my office and started working again. Maybe I should have been more worried about what the knock was, but I was so tired and wanting to get my work done that it wasn't even on my mind. After a few minutes, I stayed on the computer typing away for the better part of an hour. Nothing else seemed to happen as far as the knocking went. But I was getting exponentially more tired by the minute. My workflow was slowing, and my eyes were getting heavy. But just when I was going to call it a night, I reached over from my tea, and right in the window across the room was a pair of eyes staring back at me. All I could tell from the moment was that it was a man, but he quickly ran away from the window after I saw him. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I just sat there with my eyes locked on the window. It was so unexpected I was almost in a daze. After a moment, I stood up and ran over to cover the window. I didn't know who that was or why he was looking into my house like that, but it being almost midnight made it all the more terrifying. I left my office and went to the front of the house, looking out the peephole again to see if they'd gone to my front yard, but I didn't see him. I then went to a window on the back of the house and looked around, but again there was no one out there. My adrenaline was pumping, and I was not tired at all anymore. But the now silence of the house was starting to freak me out. Did the man leave or was he still outside? I went back to my office and got my phone, then started making my way back to the front door. My plan was to call the cops while keeping my eyes on the doors and windows. But as I got to the end of the hallway, I was met by a large figure standing in the back of the living room. He was tall and wearing thick clothes to hide his identity, but his eyes were not the same as the ones I'd seen in the window. This was someone else. The man didn't hesitate, charging across the room at me as I turned and ran from my office, locking the door behind me and pressing my body against it, preparing for them to try kicking it down as they approached the door, though they slowed to a stop and just stood right outside of it. I could hear them breathing, then starting to walk back and forth like they were pacing in the hallway. But then I heard it again, a light knocking sound on the other side of the house. The man outside the door started to walk down the hallway back toward the living room. Then it was silent for a few minutes as I stayed there against the door. There was absolutely nothing. I called the cops, whispering into my phone and begging them to come quickly. I waited for about 5 minutes before I heard the sirens approaching my house as they unlocked my front door and came in. There were no altercations. I heard them walk through the house and finally up to my door, and they never saw either of the men to this day. I still don't know how the one man got in or what the two of them were trying to do. I think the knocking was their way of communicating from inside and outside the house. But then that makes me question what the first knock was that I heard. The whole situation freaks me out every time I think about it, wondering how long the one had been watching me for and how long the other man had been inside my house. It could have ended up so much worse for me, so I know I got lucky, but it's hard not to think about the possibility of them coming back, and luck isn't what I want to rely on for my safety. I just gotten home from work and was sitting back on the couch with a movie on. It was storming outside, and it was Friday, so what better to do than stay up late and watch some TV. I had the window curtains open in case any lightning started up, hoping to catch some cool sights. It doesn't rain very often where I live, so nights like these are really rare and always get me excited. But as the night went on, and at just about midnight, I noticed something outside my window across the street. There was a man walking down the sidewalk. He had no hood or coat on and was completely soaked, but he walked up to one of the houses and onto their porch. I couldn't see too much through the rain and dark, but it looked like he was waiting for them to answer the door, and after a minute, he walked down to the sidewalk again and continued further down the street. I couldn't see any further, but seeing that gave me an uneasy feeling at this time of night and in this kind of weather. It just wasn't normal to be walking around and up to people's houses. I closed the curtains by the window, just so that if he did come to my house, then he wouldn't see me inside and expect me to answer the door. But only 15 minutes passed before there was a sound outside my house. Someone was walking up my driveway and up to my front door, but there was no knock or doorbell. I heard them moving around, walking across my porch and near one of the windows, then going back to the door. By now I was really confused and wanted to look out the peephole, but was worried that they'd hear me. I waited, and after a minute, there were no more sounds. I quietly walked up to the door and looked. It was the man I'd seen earlier, and he was still there, standing at the edge of my porch looking at the door with a blank face. I watched him for a few seconds before I got really creeped out and backed away. It was now that I started to think calling the police would be worth it, especially if he was going around to other people's houses and doing the same thing. I turned to get my phone, but then there was the sound of footsteps departing. I looked out again and he was gone after giving it some thought. I felt that this was still too creepy to not inform the police about whatever that man was doing. Was not normal. I called and let them know about it. They said they would send an officer to patrol the neighborhood and see if they can get the man to stop or explain what he was doing. But that was about all that could be done at the time. I thanked them, then hung up and checked out the door one more time before going back to the couch. The whole thing had really worn me out, though, taking away the relaxing night and just making me exhausted. I shut everything off and went upstairs to get in bed. But as I got in and turned off the lights, a thump sounded from downstairs. I sat up, and then it came again. It was loud, like someone smashing something against the wall. I got up and ran to the top of the stairs, and now hearing it for the third time, I realized it was at the front door. Someone was hitting something against it, like they were trying to forcefully break it down. I walked down a few steps and looked over, seeing the door violently shake every time they hit it. It looked like they were just a few hits away from breaking it down. Now absolutely terrified, I locked myself in the bedroom and called the police again. The operator said that an officer was in the neighborhood and would be here in just a minute. But through their voice I heard wood shatter and the door slamming against the ground. Footsteps quickly moved through the downstairs, going into every room without stopping. Then they began moving up the stairs, but were cut off by the officer, pulling in and running up to the house. The intruder immediately stopped and ran for the back door as the officer came in and yelled at him, and apparently they had trouble getting the back door open. In the heat of the moment, so the officer was able to get him down and into the car. The man, who looked like a psycho up close, refused to say anything, like not even a single word, before they drove him off. His intentions were clear, though. He was carrying a heavy hammer and had a bunch of zip ties in his pocket that Doesn't exactly sound like a coincidence considering what he was doing. Why he chose to go for my house isn't clear though, but what likely saved me was calling the police that first time. If I hadn't, the officer wouldn't have been in the neighborhood so close by and likely would have gotten here too late for me to have ever been seen again. I work 4 days a week on 10 to 12-hour overnight shifts, which means I have to sleep during the day and be up at night. At least 4 days a week, however. Switching up my sleep schedule on my days off usually causes me to get much worse sleep and just feel tired. So I started sticking to the same schedule all week. I'd usually get in bed around noon and wake up at 8 p.m. It was hard to get used to, but I had to do it for work. And after a few months, it wasn't too terrible on one of my days off a few months ago. I got up at 9:00 p.m., having breakfast and doing some chores, then went out for a run just before midnight. This was a somewhat normal-looking day off for me. Sometimes I would have my lazy days, but for the most part, I'd try to go for a run within the first few hours of my day. My house is right next to a forest preserve, so I take the same path every time. It's basically just a big loop inside the forest preserve, and I'll go around it as many times as I need before I feel like I'm done. I started going along this trail, looping around 2 full times, before a man appeared on the path. When I first noticed him, he was too far down the sea well, but it looked like he was just walking as I started to get closer. Though I realized he wasn't moving, he was wearing a dark sweatshirt and baggy pants facing my direction as I approached him when I passed by. He slowly moved his head to follow like he was watching me. I looked back and saw him still standing there. It creeped me out and had me thinking for a couple minutes. But when I looped around again, he was gone. I don't know if maybe he took a shortcut through the woods. The exit was on the opposite side from where he was standing though, and he definitely didn't pass me on the path. Him having appeared and left in such a strange way gave me a bad feeling, causing me to cut the run short and head home. I left the forest and jogged through the street to my house. When I got inside, I chugged some water and sat down, only to be startled up by a sound right outside my front door. It was almost 1 a.m., so nobody should have been at my house. I walked up and looked through the peephole. A man was on my porch, and I recognized him from his dark sweatshirt as the same man from the forest preserve. I felt my stomach drop as I watched him just stand there. He didn't knock or ring the doorbell. I must have watched him for a whole minute, seeing the man do nothing more than glance around a few times. I started to get really creeped out, thinking about how he had to have followed me home and was clearly not behaving normally. I walked back to my kitchen and quietly dialed 911, telling them about a possible stalker that was outside my house after reporting it. I went back to the door and the man was still there. He stood in the same place, glancing around and never knocking or anything. For the next 10 minutes, even when the police car pulled up, he didn't run. He acted like nothing was wrong and gave no explanation for what he was doing at my house or why he followed me, almost equally as terrifying. They couldn't actually hold the guy under arrest because he hadn't really done anything yet. It was clear his behavior was off and something was wrong with him, but it wasn't enough to do anything about it. I don't know why that guy followed me and creepily stood outside my house, but with him behaving the way he was, I wouldn't doubt it if he had something horrible in mind for